We left Europe on seemingly the brink of war. The world had gotten dangerous throughout the latter part of the 1930s. We've already discussed the coming of war directly with the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, but the tensions leading towards a greater opportunity for war seemed in the offering. The threats against Poland by Germany was bringing new commitments to defend Polish integrity by Britain and France. But as we noted, Hitler thought he had found a way out. He signed a Nazi-Soviet pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and believed that this would preserve peace from the standpoint of any invasion of Poland. Certainly the West would back down. And to be honest, who could blame him? What had the British or French done up till now that would convince anyone that they would fight, let alone fighting for Poland? And so on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invades Poland, he believes the British and French will back down, but they do not. The British and French continue the fight, they honor their agreements, and thus we are plunged into World War II. Now, Poland was defeated rather quickly. Not only were the Poles hard-pressed to try and push back the German forces, they were certainly not helped when the Soviet Union invaded from the other side, squeezing Poland between the two of them. This was part of the agreed division of Eastern Europe between the two of them as part of the secret elements of the treaty of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Now, war eventually came to the West, though the first glimmer of that conflict was a German invasion of Norway to preempt the British from using Norway as a series of bases for the British to attack or assault German shipping or German cities. Now, I note the invasion of Norway because it seems odd that we're not talking about war in the West more practically. Indeed, the British and French had committed themselves to defending Polish integrity. Why aren't we talking about the Franco-British invasion of West Germany of 1939? Well, the problem is war doesn't come. The British and the French, despite joining the war to protect Poland, largely do nothing during the early period of the war. Now, to be fair, it's not that they're doing nothing, it's that they're slowly preparing for the type of war they think is going to happen. Namely, they're preparing for what they expect, which is another huge German invasion in the West and the potential for the horrors of maybe not trench warfare, but certainly a long, bloody slog. So they're preparing their industry, their people, their armies for this longer, harder conflict. Unfortunately, to outsiders, it seems as if they're doing nothing, which is why it acquires the moniker the sitting war or Sitzkrieg. But eventually the West would not stay pacified forever, and Germany in 1940 invades the West. Panzer divisions scythe through the Ardennes forest, cutting northward deep into Allied lines, cutting off most of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force in Belgium, eventually forcing the French army to surrender and the British to have to flee the continent from Dunkirk. In a little over a month then, the hated enemy of Germany, France, had been defeated and lay prostrate at Germany's feet. So Hitler stands triumphant, famously touring Paris. What's left to resist him? Well, one country, England, and one person, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, the combative leader who, during the interwar period, had warned against this danger, Hitler, had risen to the prime ministership largely due to the invasion of Norway. The British defense of Norway was badly bungled, and that led to the fall of Neville Chamberlain and the rise of Winston Churchill in his place. And so, Hitler has an enemy, England. He has an enemy leader, Churchill. But what does Churchill have to resist? Churchill has the Royal Air Force. Germany wanted to try and invade England, but to do so they needed to prepare the ground by defeating the Royal Air Force, defeating the air power that is protecting England. And so the RAF rose to fight the many, many squadrons of the Luftwaffe that were being arrayed against them. The Royal Air Force, their pilots, support staff, and the like. Of them, Churchill would say, never was so much owed by so many to so few? So the question is, how did so few survive? How did they manage to pull it off? Well, in addition to the bravery of the pilots, in addition to the manufacturing capabilities of the Spitfire planes and the like, the real benefit and the real savior of Great Britain was an invention, radar. This radar system, a radar net, during the interwar period, the British had invested deeply in this radar net and built it along the coast of England. Radar sends out radio signals that allow you to spot and track planes well in excess that you'd be able to see them by any other means. And so what this meant was that using this radar system, the Royal Air Force could ensure that they would be able to know when and where the German planes were arriving and maximize their few pilots and few planes by getting them to the right place at the right time. And thus, despite all of the hordes of German planes, despite all the effort expended, Britain is able to survive this, the Battle of Britain, and Germany is rebuffed. Unable to overwhelm the British Isles, Germany turns in new directions to hopefully win the war. One of those directions is not one that they really intended. The Italians, Benito Mussolini joining the war in 1940, a Johnny-come-lately to the struggle, he still wanted his new Roman Empire and attempted to start trying to achieve it by pushing his forces across North Africa towards Egypt. But when they proved unable to complete the task, Germany sent a force, the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel, in the hopes that he would be able to stiffen their resistance and perhaps win that front. But the real focus of Germany after they were defeated in the Battle of Britain was to turn to the east. Hitler believed that the reason the British were still fighting was that they believed that the Soviet Union would enter the war on the side of Great Britain. And so Germany prepared and made ready plans for a massive invasion of the Soviet Union in order to take that hope out. But beyond strategy, another reason the Germans end up invading Russia in Operation Barbarossa in 1941 was that this fulfilled an ideological goal of Hitler's. Hitler had laid out that he felt that the only way forward for Germany was to achieve, as he termed it, living space in the East that would enable the German economy and the German people to prosper and become as strong and as wealthy as he believed they were always intended to be. And so in 1941, Operation Barbarossa is launched with over 3 million men being launched against the Russian forces, both of German soldiers and their allies. One ally that the Germans were happy to pick up had been a former neutral nation, the nation of Finland, which was seeking revenge for Soviet gains in Finnish territory in a war fought in 1939. And Operation Barbarossa appears to work initially. In many ways, this is the result of Stalin's purges, those horrible purges coming home to roost. But even though German forces penetrate deep into the interior, capture millions of men, come to the very gates of Moscow, they can see the spires of the Kremlin, their lead troops, they are thrown back. Russian reserves are assembled and launched against the German troops that are, by this point, frozen by the Russian winter and are hurled back hundreds of miles. And thus, the Germans are pushed back and victory is denied them. And so if Russia adds an entire continental power to this struggle, one other action in 1941 adds an additional continental power. The Japanese, looking to expand their empire and gain the natural resources they believe are rightly theirs, decide to conduct a sneak attack against the U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor, and in doing so, they hope to cripple the Pacific Fleet. This was a tactical and strategic blunder as the sneak attack rallied the Americans to fight and launched the American forces full force into the Pacific War. Additionally, Hitler, out of Axis solidarity, joined the war as well, meaning that now, by the end of 1941, you were contemplating the war being expanded across the globe, with the Soviet Union and the United States joining with Great Britain and the Free French forces to form the Allied powers. Now, we tend to think of this as, oh, those silly Germans and silly Japanese, didn't they know the war was up in 1941? Well, the problem was, it didn't seem that way for much of 1942. Japan, despite not destroying the American carriers that they hoped might be at Pearl Harbor, still over the course of the next few weeks and months, seemed to achieve nearly every goal they set before themselves. Indeed, after a few months, they had conquered nearly everything they intended to conquer during the entire war. This has led some authors to allege that the Japanese were suffering from so-called victory disease, where their forces were just meandering around looking for a fight, hoping to figure out how exactly to make the war end, because as far as they were concerned, they had conquered everything they wanted. In the same way, the Germans launch a massive summer offensive in 1942. This was a shock to the Russian troops, who believed the Germans had been defeated after their falling back in 1941. And this massive offensive pushed deep into the Ukraine, deep into the Caucasus, in an attempt to gain the grain and the oil needed for this long war. This thrust was an attempt to gain the vital resources of the Russian state and help Germany become economically self-sufficient. Not only would this hold the goal of helping Germany continue the war, it would help Hitler fulfill a goal of both the fascist leaders of supposedly attaining autarky, economic self-sufficiency, and an ability to power their own economy without any help. But as the Germans pushed in as part of the summer offensive, they were met by an obstacle: the city of Stalingrad. And while the German planes were able to pound the city into dust, the problem was the fight didn't end. As German troops advanced, they found Russian forces willing to fight street by street, house by house, room by room. And Stalingrad very quickly became a charnel house of horrors, as millions of Soviet and German troops were thrown in the maelstrom in an attempt to find victory. The battle continued and dragged on, and eventually the Russians, similar to Moscow, were able to assemble reserves behind the line, push through, cut off the German troops at Stalingrad, forcing those there to surrender. In total, the Stalingrad campaign was a horrible failure for the German forces. In the Pacific, you also had a critical battle that occurred, with the American-Japanese fleets meeting at the Battle of Midway. Both forces met in the Pacific near the island of Midway, unleashing their carrier forces, an opportunity for both sides to smash the naval striking power of their opponent. And so both these battles, the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Midway, carried with it the opportunity to change the war, to be a turning point in the war. Indeed, they were turning points, but turning points against the Axis powers. The German Sixth Army was cut off and forced to surrender, and their losses and added to the totals across the campaign meant that the Germans and their German allies took 850,000 casualties during the fight for Stalingrad, a devastating defeat. And no less devastating was the defeat for the Japanese at Midway. 4 of their carriers were sunk, and hundreds of their most veteran and skilled pilots were lost, as with the loss of the carriers, the pilots had no place to land. And so these were turning points in both the European theater and the Pacific theater. In Europe, the end of the war would come as the Soviets, after the success at Stalingrad and later at in rebuffing the German attempt to take the offensive in Operation Citadel, the Soviets would continue to push westwards deep into Eastern Europe and eventually into Germany. And as the Germans attempted to fight off the Soviets, they were met with another problem. Finally, the famed Second Front opened up with the Operation Overlord and the invasion of Normandy. And as this map depicts, from west and from east, the German forces were pushed in and, like in a vice, were squeezed until they were forced to surrender in May of 1945. In the Pacific, The U.S. adopted a strategy to try and win the war in the Pacific, recognizing that any number of the islands were well entrenched and defended by Japanese forces. The Americans attempted what they termed an island hopping campaign, where they would jump from critical island to critical island, bypassing many Japanese defensive systems in order to try and force the Japanese to fight when and where the Americans wanted and force them to abandon bases elsewhere. This strategy would eventually allow them to march across the Pacific, eventually reaching islands very close to the Japanese home islands, which were fought over at the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The taking of these islands enabled the U.S. to have airfields within reach of Japan so they could begin bombings of Japanese cities in an attempt to bring the Japanese to the peace table, or rather to surrender. These included such famed raids as the Tokyo raid, in which over 100,000 Japanese died in a single night of firebombing. But though these captures of these islands enabled the U.S. to strike the Japanese home islands with their air power, the problem was the capture of those islands also underscored for military planners the horrors that might be yet to come. In planning for an invasion of Japan in Operation Downfall, American planners were struck by the casualty figures in just taking those two small islands, and many started to fear of casualties in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, in trying to take the Japanese home islands. In doing so, some planners began searching for any means by which they would be able to win the war without invading Japan proper, and thus we get the cause of the use of the atomic bomb, this new weapon that was unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which eventually brings an end to the conflict in the Pacific. Now, I covered a lot in this lecture, and one of the things I want to end with is underscoring that this is certainly a lecture that you want to square with your readings. I didn't talk about the war in all its detail, certainly. I tried to hit some of the major events, major turning points, but there's a lot more detail certainly to this, one of the largest and most important wars in world history. So be sure to attend to your reading. But I do want to end with this image and a acknowledgement that this image helps frame the rest of the lectures we're going to read. You cannot understand post-war Europe, you cannot understand the major social and political changes we're going to cover in the rest of this module without this chilling sign of devastation, because the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki seemed to suggest to anyone that any future conflict might carry with it the potential for such devastation. And that fear of the atomic bomb, the belief that the atomic bomb hung over the heads of every person in the world, is the only way that you can understand some of the developments we're going to talk about in the next several lectures.